Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Madison Douthat. I'm staff at ACE, but today you'll be hearing from Rachel. So Rachel, I'll let you go ahead and take it away if you'll introduce yourself and start with your presentation.
Well, hello everyone. I am Rachel Teeter, and this is my Batty about bats presentation about what I've been doing here in Cumberland Gap. So first, a little bit about myself. This is my second term with ACE since I graduated from Lincoln Memorial University. Lincoln Memorial University is coincidentally about 5 minutes south of where I'm working right now. And much of my undergraduate research dealt with bats, and my main research paper was doing a bat biodiversity survey. That photo on the left is myself putting out a bat recorder, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about bat recorders in the next few slides. But my position here has been a lot this summer, giving cave tours and telling people about bats and how bats are pretty awesome. And hopefully after my presentation today, you guys will think bats are pretty cool too. Now, whenever I am talking with people about bats, I've found that I sometimes get a mixed bag of reactions. Sometimes people think that they are pretty cool, myself included, and sometimes people don't like bats at all. And I can kind of understand why, because they do look a little bit creepy sometimes. They do have the association with vampires. However, I would like to mention that while vampire bats do exist, that we don't have any of them here in our park. In fact, as far as I know, there aren't any resident vampire bats in the United States. With climate change, it's possible that might change in the coming next years. And there have been vampire bats spotted on the southernmost tip of Texas, but as of recording this video, there are no resident vampire bats in the US. They also are associated with rabies, and that is a definite concern whenever you're working with bats. I know people who handle bats do have to get a rabies vaccine. And while most rabies cases in the United States do come from bats, these are very few and far between. Only a couple dozen total human rabies cases in the United States have been recorded in the past couple of decades. And as long as you are being safe, bat safe, then you will likely not catch rabies from a bat. What I mean by bat safe is, number one, if you have a bat in your house, do not touch it with your bare hands. If you want, you can call a professional to come and take care of it for you. There's also the association with bats at night, and things that happen at night tend to be kind of creepy. And that's going to be bats or owls or wolves or a lot of different nocturnal creatures that do have negative connotations because they are nocturnal. And that's just how it is. Now, what bats do we have in Cumberland Gap? We have over a dozen different species of bats, 6 of which are found in Gap Cave. That's going to be the big brown bat, the little brown bat, the northern long-eared bat, the Indiana bat, the tricolored bat, and the eastern red bat are all found in Gap Cave, which is our main cave system here in the park. All of these bats are insectivorous, which means that they eat insects. And most of our bats are about the size of your 2 thumbs put together, and their wingspan are your 2 pinkies spread out from there. I like to say that they look a little bit like a burnt chicken nugget on the side of a cave wall. Most bats that you do see in Gap Cave are going to be either little brown bats or tricolored bats. The photo on the right there is a tricolored bat that was taken in Gap Cave. And I do want to talk a little bit about bat biodiversity real quick. So biodiversity is a count of how many different species you have in an area or in a group. And bats are the second most biodiverse group of mammals in the entire world, with over 1,400 different species. In the United States alone, there are over 47 different species, but they are not a monolith. Bats can be really different from each other. There are bats like our bats that eat insects, but there are also bats that drink blood. There are bats that eat fruit. There are bats that drink nectar. There are bats that eat fish, and there are even bats that eat other bats. They are definitely not the same. And I feel like that's one misconception that a lot of people get, is that all bats are very similar. Some people I talk to don't even know that there are different species of bats, which I think is interesting. So why are bats cool? The first thing that I think that makes bats cool is their ability to fly. Unlike birds, bats do not have hollow bones and they have to rely on their large wingspan to body ratio to help them fly. And they are the only mammals capable of powered flight. Sure, there are flying squirrels, but that is just falling with style. Another little misconception that I'd like to clear up is that bats are not rodents. They are not mice with wings, despite what the German word for bats might try and convince you otherwise. They are in their own order called Chiroptera, and it means hand wave. This here is a spectrogram. I think that echolocation is another thing that makes bats really cool. Another misconception is that bats are blind. They are most definitely not blind. Some species of bats don't even use echolocation. They use their sense of sight and their sense of smell to find food. But echolocation is basically when a bat yells out into the void and then they can hear sound waves bounce off of whatever is in front of their face. And the faster the sound wave comes back to them, then the closer that thing is. And bats use echolocation for a lot of different things. For example, to find food, which is what everyone associates bat echolocation with, but they also use it to find places to land, water to drink, or even communication with other bats. And bats do mostly use echolocation to find food because it's a lot easier than just seeing it, obviously. And echolocation can help them see really fine stuff. I know one method of doing bat biodiversity surveys is catching them physically. What scientists will do is they'll put up a mist net. Oh, it looks a little bit like a volleyball net, but with really super thin netting. They'll put it up over an area where they know bats are going to be flying, and then they'll wait for bats to fly into the net. And some species of bats have echolocation that is so fine, they are able to detect where these mist nets are and they will avoid them, which is one reason why it's really important to use methods like bat recording. Because bat recorders can get all species of bats that use echolocation in an area, because you know this is a species that is here and you don't have to worry about maybe it avoiding your mist net. I mentioned earlier that I did a biodiversity study about 5 minutes south of where I'm working now in Lincoln Memorial University. And that's actually one thing that I try and bring up to visitors whenever I'm talking to visitors about bats, is that some of these spectrograms, like this one that I'm showing on this presentation right now, I recorded this in 2020, about 5 minutes south of them. And I think they are really impressed by that. Another reason that I think bats are cool is because of their sociability. The ability of a bat to get along with others is really key to their survival. Many bat species need to clump up together in really big groups, especially when they are hibernating, so that they can conserve body heat. And whenever little brown bats hibernate in Gap Cave, it is said like they look like they're all trying to stick their butts on the same square inch. And they also engage in allogrooming, which is when they lick each other. And I know that's a trait that a lot of people associate with monkeys or cats, but bats are very clean animals. And that's another misconception, is that bats are dirty, but they are definitely very clean animals. They like to lick themselves, they like to lick each other. And some bat species, like the evening bat, have even been documented feeding the young of other individuals that are not related to them, which I think is pretty cool. Bats use echolocation to tell others where good food is, where predators are, and more. And as a lot of us have learned in the past couple years, being a social butterfly is not always very beneficial. This is a photo of a bat, of a tricolored bat specifically, that was taken in Gap Cave, and it has white nose syndrome. White nose syndrome is a disease caused by the fungus Pseudogymnoascus destructans. It was introduced to the United States in 2006 from Europe, and it causes this white fuzzy growth around the bat's muzzle, or any skin that is not covered by fur. It gets inside the bat's nose and mouth while they are hibernating, and it causes them to wake up from hibernation. And I mentioned earlier that bats like to groom themselves, they like to clean themselves. So whenever a bat has white nose syndrome and it wakes up in the middle of winter, it will spend precious fat reserves cleaning off all this white gunk that has gotten onto its nose and mouth. Eventually, it will have to fly out of the cave to find food to eat to replenish those fat reserves, and that is when the bat will perish, unfortunately. This is a map of the United States of North America that shows the spread of white nose syndrome. This is kind of sad. This was produced by the White Nose Syndrome Working Group. The red X on the map shows where white nose syndrome was introduced to a cave in New York. However, you can see that it has spread all over the US since then. One thing I'd like to point out is this little group over here out in Washington. It is not very likely that a bat flew from a cave on the East Coast out west. People can be a fomite that spreads white nose syndrome from cave to cave. And it's likely that's how it was first introduced to the United States in the first place, is you had some people who were spelunking in Europe and they came over to the US and entered a cave and they brought white nose syndrome to the United States. What's interesting is that white nose syndrome is on most of the bats in Europe, those cave bats, but they are not affected by white nose syndrome. It's kind of similar to how smallpox was introduced to the United States by European settlers and the native population was unable to handle it, but the native settlers had already built up a resistance to it. What's also interesting about white nose syndrome is that it's kind of, well, it's a fungus for one thing, and it can survive without the host species. There are other examples of fungi that have produced these awful pandemics. For example, the fungus that is causing the chestnut blight. And it is able to survive in red oaks, even without chestnuts. So that is why we can't get new mature chestnuts. With bats, you do not have to have a bat for white nose syndrome to exist in a cave. It can grow by itself on surfaces. It's also interesting because it is psychrophilic, which means that white nose syndrome enjoys cold environments. It's kind of similar to when you have food in your refrigerator that you've forgotten about for a month or so. You come back after a while and it's got all this white fuzzy stuff growing on it. That's just like white nose syndrome. And it's really frustrating too, because white nose syndrome cannot survive outside of caves. Part of the reason for this is because it is not able to heal itself from ultraviolet radiation. And if you take white nose syndrome outside of a cave, it will not survive. That's part of the reason why they had such a hard time figuring out what exactly was killing bats for the first couple of years, because whenever they were taking the spores from the bats and trying to culture it in a lab environment, they were using warm petri dishes, which is what you usually do when you're trying to culture a microscopic organism. However, white nose syndrome likes cold stuff, as we mentioned earlier. So once they finally figured out how to get that cultured, they were able to figure out that it was a new species of fungus that was killing bats. Now, why should I care about bats? Besides the inherent value in living creatures in general, bats do perform a valuable ecosystem function for humans. They are the primary nighttime predator of flying insects, specifically mosquitoes. I know a lot of people definitely don't like mosquitoes, partially because they spread diseases like West Nile or Zika or malaria. And bats love to eat mosquitoes. In fact, some bat species can eat over 1,000 mosquito-sized insects in a single hour. A lot of bats eat half their body weight in insects every night, and they can eat even more than that if they are trying to feed their young. And that's just including bats that like to eat insects, because there are other ecosystem functions performed by bats, specifically bats that like nectar are really good pollinators. The agave plant is primarily pollinated by bats. So without bats, you wouldn't have tequila. There's also bats, of course, that eat fruit. They like to spread seeds. So I believe cacao is a seed that is spread by bats, and also wild bananas is something that is spread by bats. Bats are just really important in general to people, and that's why we have to do some things to help bats out. So how can I help bats? One way that you can help bats is by staying out of caves. This large picture here is a photo of Skylight Cave with a sign outside of it that requests that people stay out of the cave. We do not have a gate on Skylight Cave. We just ask out of goodwill, please do not go into Skylight Cave because there are bats in there. Bats are entering caves, and whenever people enter caves during the winter that have bats in them, we can disturb them, and bats already have enough to deal with bats, with white-nose syndrome. Another thing that you can do to help bats out is by building bat houses. Bat houses are a little bit like bird houses, except instead of birds on the inside, we get bats, and they are usually open on the bottom so that bats can fly up inside there. Especially larger bat houses with multiple chambers are really good because they can house maternity colonies. And with maternity colonies, you get more bats, which is always a good thing. You can also spread the word about bats. I know a lot of people that I've talked to this summer have never heard of white-nose syndrome and how important it is. If you want to tell your friends and family about how important bats are, or post about it on social media, getting the word out is definitely important in spreading the news about white-nose syndrome. Because humans are generally the primary mover of white-nose syndrome around to different areas. I know I mentioned earlier about how white-nose syndrome cannot really survive outside of caves, but the spores from white-nose syndrome can. And they can survive on your clothing, on your shoes for years after you've been inside of a cave. And that's why it's important to not enter caves that have not had white-nose syndrome if you have previously been inside a cave that has had white-nose syndrome. Another way that you can help bats out is by using fewer pesticides. Pesticides can bioaccumulate inside of bats, meaning that while an insect will pass okay through the bat's body, the pesticide will stick around and eventually poison the bat. And a final thing that you can do to help bats out is by planting a pollinator garden. I know there was another ACE Learns presentation about planting native plants, and that is definitely helpful. You can try to plant different flowers that are good for moths, and yeah, planting a native plant pollinator garden is really helpful to bats. All right. Thank you everyone for listening to my presentation about bats, especially in Cumberland Gap. I am open to taking questions now.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself or throw questions in the chat.
What's your favorite bat?
I really like gray bats, kind of because of their general history. One of the primary researchers of bats in the world is Dr. Merlin Tuttle, and he actually grew up around the Knoxville area, which is about an hour south of us, which I think is pretty cool. A lot of his early research, whenever he was first getting into bats and learning more about them, dealt with gray bats specifically. And he used to ride a little boat around Norris Reservoir looking for bats. And you can read all about his adventures in the book, The Secret Life of Bats by Dr. Merlin Tuttle. It's a really good book. I do recommend reading it. And I also recommend supporting the organization that he founded called Bat Conservation International. It's an organization dedicated to making sure that bats don't go extinct. They do have a lot of information on their website on how to build bat houses if you don't want to purchase one. But yes, I really like gray bats. They need specific caves for them to hibernate in, for them to build maternity colonies in. And there are only a few caves that support gray bats in the United States, and these are protected caves, which I think is pretty cool. Good question. Thank you. I'm going to open up the
Thanks,
chat.
Rachel.
Yeah, we have a question. Are all bats in North America susceptible to white-nose syndrome, or are there just certain species?
Yes, not all bats in North America are susceptible to white-nose syndrome. I know I mentioned earlier that the bats in Europe are not susceptible to white-nose syndrome, but it also depends on whether that bat likes to hibernate in caves. Only cave bats are susceptible to white-nose syndrome. So this excludes bats like hoary bats, which are tree bats. And it also depends on the hibernating habits of the bats inside the cave. For example, I mentioned earlier about how a lot of bat species like to stick all their butts in the same square inch. That is very bad for spreading illnesses because they can obviously ping around to all the different bats. But if you've got certain species like big brown bats, which do not like to hibernate super close together, they are more loners. They will not get too close to each other, and they are not as susceptible to white nose syndrome as the smaller bat species like little brown bats or tricolored bats, that sort of thing. But that is a very good question. Thank you.
Cool. Judy, I'll get back to your question, but Jenny asked, because it kind of relates to this, how does white nose affect bats who roost in trees and bat houses? So is that kind of what you were talking about?
Yes, bats that roost in trees or human buildings are not affected by white nose syndrome. I mentioned a little bit earlier about how white nose syndrome is psychrophilic. It has to have a cave environment in order to grow. So it has to reach, I can't remember exactly the exact temperature that it has to be inside a cave. But if it's warmer than that temperature, then the fungus will not grow. It's just unfortunate that that temperature just happens to be the exact same temperature that a lot of bats need to hibernate.
Cool. And then love bats, help with mosquitoes. Do they carry fleas?
I have not heard about bats carrying fleas, but I have heard about them carrying mites. I know there are mites specifically dedicated to bats that you won't find on other animals. I haven't done too much research into that, but I do know that it's a thing. And I know that some people are also concerned about whenever they have a large bat colony in their homes, the mites escaping from those bats into the rest of their house. And that is definitely a concern. And I would recommend, if you do have a large bat colony in your house, you get that taken care of, call a professional to professionally exclude those bats during the off season when they are not mating. But I would need to do more research about the fleas.
Cool. Thanks, Rachel. So I know you mentioned some ways that we can help bats, but can anything be done to manage white nose syndrome?
Right now, the way that we are kind of managing white nose syndrome is kind of like the saying, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So right now we're just trying to keep white nose from spreading to new caves where it has not yet been introduced. It's likely that it will spread to most of the caves around North America, which is not great. And what we're trying to do is hopefully slow it down so that the bats can build up some sort of resistance. Unfortunately, they are not likely to evolve a resistance to white nose syndrome sometime in our life. And a lot of bats need to be in large colonies. So if you have these colonies that are being reduced to very small numbers, then at some point you're going to hit a threshold where the bats won't come back, which is what we're hoping will not happen. It's kind of similar to how the passenger pigeons needed to have large groups of passenger pigeons. And at some point during the end of passenger pigeon existence, they did get some protections, but it was just too little too late. So we're trying to make sure right now that we do not spread white nose syndrome to new caves, which is kind of difficult because a lot of people don't even know that white nose syndrome is a big deal. And that's why it's important to tell other people, kind of like what I'm doing.
Awesome. So tell your friends.
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn said, I live in Knoxville. What are some of your favorite places in Cumberland Gap that you'd recommend to visit? Best places / times to see bats?
Over the summer, I have given over 50 cave tours, or at least helped with over 50 cave tours. So the best place to see a bat is on a Gap cave tour. We will be probably starting them up in April or May, depending on whether we get the staff or not. Cave tours are really great. I know before white nose syndrome was introduced to Gap Cave in, I think, 2013, we had so many bats in our cave. I've been told, I wasn't here. But now we are lucky if we see about a dozen bats. And that's kind of sad because Gap Cave is the best place to see bats in the Cumberland Gap in the park. I also recommend that outside of just wanting to see bats, Everyone who comes to our park should go visit the pinnacle. It's a really nice view, even on a cloudy day.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, the bat tour is awesome. When we got to visit Rachel earlier this year, we got a stellar cave tour, so 10 out of 10 would recommend. We have another question. Can cavers disinfect their gear after caving?
It kind of depends on the gear. For example, if you can throw it into the washer and the dryer, then you're golden. However, for stuff like backpacks or cameras that cannot be thrown into a washer or dryer, I definitely would not recommend bringing that into a different cave because it's really difficult to get all those spores off of your clothing. I mean, off of the gear that you've brought in. There are some photos online, I know, of chiropterologists that are going into different caves and they look like they have so much hazmat gear on because they're trying not to spread it from cave to cave.
This is just a me question. Do you know if there's like a GIS mapper somewhere that people can check if they're going into a cave where it says if there's been white nose in that cave?
As far as I know, the most comprehensive maps have been put out by, there we go. Nope. By the White Nose Syndrome Working Group. And this just goes by county. I would maybe, if you're planning on visiting a park, maybe contact the people in charge of that park and ask them whether white nose syndrome has been introduced to that area or not. And also asking about best caving practices in that park would probably be helpful.
Awesome, thank you. I love going on cave tours, but is it bad for touristy caves to have high visitation rates? Should we reduce the amount of people going into these types of caves, or is it fine to continue doing that frequently?
I would say it kind of depends on the cave. I personally am kind of weighing it between some caves I would like to have visitation in because it's important to show people this is a resource that we have and you can enjoy it. And this is the sort of creatures that live in this cave because there's only so much you can do just by showing photos of things. Sometimes you got to get people into these places hands-on so that they can actually see what's going on in these places. And there are definitely caves that are super duper important and we should close those off. For example, I mentioned earlier about gray bats and how they have specific caves that they are able to breed in. And those caves should probably be closed off because they are super duper special. But Gap Cave has been used as a tourist cave for a very long time now. I know on the inside of the cave, there are actually graffiti marks from Civil War soldiers that have been in that cave during the Civil War. And I know whenever white nose syndrome was first spreading, people definitely closed off a lot of caves just to make sure that it wouldn't get spread to new caves. And that's definitely a consideration. But I also think that we need to consider the fact that ecotourism is a definite industry. We sort of need to weigh the pros and cons between that sort of thing.
Awesome. Any other questions for Rachel? Cool. Well, maybe we'll stick around for a minute or two. But if there aren't any other questions, thanks so much, Rachel, for sharing your expertise. It's so fun to learn about. And yeah, like I said, Cumberland Gap is phenomenal. So get out there if you're in the area. But yeah, thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.